Hi there. Thank you so much for listening to Grounded in Maine today. My name is Amy Fagan, and my guest today is Christopher Reynolds of Reynolds Sebastiani Design. And Christopher has some really fun stuff that he is teaching and working in the sustainability field. So, Christopher, I'm so thrilled to have you on to talk about everything that you're doing because it's so important.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to be here and to share time with you.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you were telling me, so I'll just say I found you on Podmatch, but then we started talking on Instagram, which you're not really on anymore. But I was looking at your Instagram feed, and you've been te teaching or just showing how important it is to include like native plants
Yes.
for, many different reasons. And this is it's a platform for you to talk about what you're doing, which is so cool. So feel free to go on about that because I love that you are simply just encouraging people to include natives and why.
Yeah. So I think, like so many of the people that are alive right now, we're all experiencing a lot of fear and grief, and the the threats of climate change and uh, I mean, the existential threats that we could go, there's a huge list, so we don't need to name them all, but they feel so overwhelming and so terrifying. And there's a lot of apathy because there's this sense that it's not possible to correct those things in any meaningful way in a in a timeline that will save us from ourselves. And what I've come to realize is that the solutions are actually available to us fairly quickly and we could see a world that is unlike the world that we're in right now in as little as a single generation, and that the work to get there is available to us all, and that we have access to small incremental shifts in our understanding of the world that we live in and the way that we manage the world that we live in that will create a cascade of effects that exponentially quickly like create a world that is rebuilt in ways that we can't even yet imagine. So yes, planting native plants is the biggest part that I advocate for, but part of the understanding is looking to projects that have already been successful, like rewilding projects, which we can unpack in a moment, but some large scale projects where we were able to see entire ecosystems rebuilt in as little as 20 years, which is just one generation. And not everyone that will listen, was born in the 90s, but many of us were. And so to me, that doesn't feel like very long ago that work was begun then. And I remember when some of that work was started and how hopeful I felt that that work would become, unrealizing how incredibly more profoundly altered those systems would be.
Yeah, I love the idea of um, one, when you said save us from ourselves. For
Yeah.
but and that was when I first started this podcast, somebody had asked me like, why sustainability, Amy? And I sort of half jokingly, I was like, I grew up in the 80s. Like we did this. Like this is our fault, sort of.
Hmm.
And so it's sort of my way to pay back, but also um we are very in tune in the fact that you were saying, it can be very overwhelming and very scary, but it doesn't have to be. Like we don't need to focus on that. We can focus on what we can do.
Yeah. And tiny, tiny, tiny shifts pay off in ways that we can't even imagine. And so I think I'd like to talk more about those projects and expand on those because I think they're really thrilling and exhilarating for everyone to understand what happened.
Please.
But tiny little shifts create shifts beyond them with every season. So biodiversity begets biodiversity, abundance grows on abundance, and the carrying capacity, the ability of this earth to support more beings, more than we have now, is more incredible than we understand in this moment. The land is has the opportunity to support so much more biodiversity than we even know is possible. And so, for instance, like at Yellowstone, in the 1990s, there was some studies into understanding some ecological collapses that were happening there. And so researchers were kind of puzzling at why there were no more aspen and why there was no more willow lining the banks of the rivers. And the last date of the last aspen to have ever grown was 70 years in the past, and it coincided with the exact same date that the last wolf in the park was shot.
Oh,
So the researchers were able to recognize that it had to have something to do with the wolves, and that they were somehow integral into all of these other things that 70 years later, they were only 70 years later that they noticed had become major problems. And so there was work to restore the wolves to Yellowstone in hopes of reversing whatever it was that was the problem with the aspen. And there obviously wolves don't eat aspen, so trying to understand what those links were was kind of like that was the early work that was happening in the 90s. And I remember that those conversations happening. And ultimately, they did return the wolves. And within just a few years, the wolves' behavior on the grazing animals changed the behavior of the grazing animals. And that was the goal, was to keep the elk and the deer from eating the aspen or the willow. But no one anticipated how much more important the wolves were than just that. And spaces that had disappeared and no one had noticed were gone reappeared quickly. And for every year that a new thing would appear, that would support a level of complexity the following year that grew exponentially. And so it didn't take 20 years to see the results. It took only like 5 and then 10 and then 20. But for every single growing season, the first the plants came back because they weren't being overgrazed. Then the insects came back, and then the insects fed small critters and birds, and those each layer supported a layer the following year, so that another thing could return with exponential growth, and then the next year a new thing completely would return. And so within the span of 20 years, the ecosystem hadn't rebuilt itself as it had been before, but it reset itself to be functional again, and that's what's so incredible. And so the riverbanks were stabilized by returning willow, and beavers returned, and the paths of the rivers stabilized and changed the marginal spaces in between these overgrazed grasslands and the wooded spaces became thickets of space that were neither grassland nor wooded, but were a space that no one really recognized were missing. And then that created an ecospace for other things to thrive that had been dependent on those marginal spaces that didn't exist. And also the riparian zones, which are the spaces that are marginal to the aquatic zones, those returned in ways that no one realized were missing. And so the complexity and the diversity that was dependent on complexity, it all returned with each generation of time. It rebuilt itself, and within 20 years, we can see that the whole system was functional again in a way that each web of the web of life was interdependent in ways that we didn't appreciate were there. And so all of that really is to say that it starts with putting back as many of the pieces back into the puzzle that we can, and then stepping back and letting the puzzle put itself back together. And so the most fundamental of that work that we have access to is planting natives.
Okay. Now, so you were saying you remember these studies being done
Yeah.
in the 90s, but did you know all of this in the 90s?
No one knew, and not even the researchers that were hoping to do. I followed it because I've always been interested in the natural world and wild things and wildlife shows. So I remember it when it was happening, and I remember how exciting it was for the scientists who were studying it to just see the early shifts happening. But now that we have 20 some odd years of experience with it, it's really incredible how much the level of biodiversity that was hoped for was surpassed very quickly within like 5 or 10 years, and then it's continued to grow in ways that was unimaginable to even what the highest expectations were. So that's the exciting part, is that we can restore our natural world, and it can happen really quickly. And because it happens exponentially, what at first seems like very small changes actually build on themselves to snowball in ways that we no longer have control over, and happen really quickly and happen in ways that interact with each other. So we can do small inputs up front that in just a small amount of time are themselves creating inputs that are multiplying on themselves.
Mhm. I love that.
So
Mhm.
that's what's exciting about that, is that means that we don't have to do very much in order to appreciate a lot more in time. it's like exponential interest being paid on our service to the land.
Oh, I love that. Can you say that again? Exponential. I'm gonna.
Exponential interest being paid on our service to the land.
Okay. Um, okay. Very good. Uh, I'll have to edit that. Um, so it's also fascinating. And so really just planting native plants.
Yeah, because the thing is that native plants are fundamental to the ecology of wherever you are, and so you're whatever is native to you is going to be different from anywhere else. So understanding what natives are native to your region is first, and then exploring how to get them is second, but then putting them in.
Mhm.
Um, and in horticulture, up until just recently, the idea was like, oh, how do you plant water conservative plants or climate appropriate plants? And they could come from anywhere in the world
Right.
as long as they're from the same climate. That's cool and all if you're looking at like how to water them, but it doesn't serve butterflies. It doesn't serve bees or anything that's native to your space. And if your goal is to see your wild world that is specific to where you are and it's specific to everyone and to where everywhere where they are, we can live again in spaces that mirror what was here before we got here
Right.
just by planting natives that are native to where we are. And each native plant will have an almost one-to-one ratio with a native insect. So and native insects are juicy little pills that feed everything else. So if we don't have insects, and we're having an insect collapse globally, and it's pretty easy to see why. Like,
Mhm.
not only are we using insecticides, which is not my conversation, but
Right.
we don't have the native plants that fed those insects in the regions from which they are native to. And there's a very close, tight association between a certain plant and a certain insect. And, it's easy and exciting to talk about butterflies because butterflies are something beautiful that everyone can appreciate. And when you talk about bugs, it creeps out a lot of people. But, before a butterfly is a butterfly, it's a caterpillar, and a caterpillar is nothing but a juicy pill of fat. It's like it's a wriggling, juicy ball of fat that feeds chicks. Almost all chicks are reared on caterpillars. So without caterpillars, we don't have birds. So there's so many different ways in which insects interface with everything else, and it's really scary how few insects we have, and it's really easy to get insects back, and that starts with planting plants that feed insects, and
Mm.
then everything else around that. Those are two levels of the sort of layers of how ecological webs are built. And then once you have native plants and native insects, then all the things that are dependent on those early stages of biodiversity can then have a source.
Okay. And so I would love to, if you are open to this, I'd love to speak about how you are creating your own little haven. Um, if this feels like the right time for you, or if you wanted to talk about something else, because I know
No, I'm happy to. On one hand, I want to inspire and educate as many people as will listen on how simple and exciting it is. And I found that I was not a native plant person. I was a design person, and I thought that native plants were for hippies and that they weren't chic, and that I wanted to use design-driven plants. And I have many people feel the same way, that they have this garden that they expect to look a certain kind of way, and and as soon as you understand the benefits of having natives, then that's really exciting to people, and I think you get buy-in really quickly without having to be preachy and
right.
it also can be design driven. So one way that I'm trying to create a haven for us all is in that education piece. In my own life, I have a park project that is 40 acres in the redwoods in California that has been clear cut twice, is in pretty devastated shape, has really bad biodiversity. It originally had 630 native plants, and if you were on a really good hike across all the acreages, you might see 15 plants or at best, 20 or 30. So that's like 600 missing plants. And each of those represents some component piece of a web of things that we can't get the other layers of biodiversity without returning as much of those native plants as possible. So my work is in my work for that project is restorative in that I want to create space for and then track down the missing plants. And then adjacent with all the things is all the things I want to get out of a garden, like grapes and apples, which are not native, or varieties of which that are native are not delicious. I want to also have component pieces that I just love, and that people around me love and are of productive value to the people and community around me. So um, the idea of the park isn't just a food forest, but it's also a resource forest, like fiber for basket making or um, dye or any of the ways that in which we have always been dependent on our ecology around us for our basic needs. I would love to see the park offer those things and then be a contribution to the community in which the park resides. And I'm inspired by national parks like in Scandinavia. They're seen as resources for the community rather than the way that we see it is very static, where we go and we camp there and we hike, but you're not allowed to touch it or change it. And just our treading on it, of course, has an impact, but we're not allowed to sort of reap the benefits of our common ownership. And so I would love to see a model in here where we're engaging with the land to make it more biodiverse and more abundant, but then we're also getting to appreciate what that means is to live with the land and to enjoy the bounty of the land and to share that with everybody,
Mm.
and recognizing that land is never really ours. Like as much as I'd like to believe that I own anything, it's like, what do you ever own? And at best, I can steward it for my life, and I can do my best to see an impact on that space and hope that that serves more people than just me.
Hmm. That I'm visioning this park as like brown. Is it like brown, like dirt everywhere? I mean, you said it's been clear cut and it only
Oh
had like
no, well, it was clear cut in the 1920s, and then it was clear cut probably in the 1860s before that. So the redwoods have regrown.
okay.
Um, okay, this is a conversation though that applies to everywhere. It applies to where you are and everywhere else. Everywhere we can just assume that if you're in a forest, it's been clear cut. All forests,
Yeah.
by and large, have been clear cut at least once. And I don't think a regular person walking through the woods sees that, but it's true that they've all been modified in ways that are bizarrely traumatic. So if you just let's just take any given forest. If you clear cut it once, then you expose everything. An old growth forest is full of complexity. It's full of super different nuanced environments where you have full sun and full shade and any number of spaces in between deeply wooded and open space with grasslands and shrublands and then you have ancient trees that fell over and are rotting and are home to animals or other plants or there's so many different layers of ages of plants and exposure to the sun and exposure to the wind, and each of those little eco spaces is a home to a certain kind. It's an individual condition that supports an individual thing, either plant or animal or a synergy between the two.
Hmm.
And when you clear cut a forest, you open the entire space up to a uniform condition. It's generally full sun. And like all the little beautiful mosses that held water, soaked up water and sponged it up and released it slowly, all those things fry. And you create this sort of like desert landscape in what was a complex system. And then what regrows in the wake of all that sun exposure and exposure to everything else are the few things that were meant to grow up in open cleared spaces. Because disturbance happens always in natural systems. You have storms or fires or things that clear out open space, and so systems are dependent on those disturbances. And so you have the things that are meant to be colonists that overtake newly disturbed spaces that are already intrinsic to the natural system. But when you have disturbance across the whole land, then you have opportunistic plants that were meant to be opportunistic take over the whole thing, and then the subsequent evolution from there is always skewed toward the if all those plants grow up uniformly at the same time in the same age, then they continue to perpetuate uniformity.
Hmm.
Even if we succumb to new eco spaces, it's going to be uniformly shaded or uniform. Everything is a uniform tallness and a uniform. The trunks are all the same size. The canopy's all in the exact same elevation. The
Right.
canopy all lifts at the exact same time. And so as the canopy lifts, it creates a condition under the canopy where there's not enough shade. Excuse me, other way around. Too much shade, not enough sun. That everything that now was dependent on living in the nuances of the understory are completely devoid of sun. So you don't even though the forest has appeared to regrow in that the trees are starting to repopulate, it doesn't mean that all of the complexity below the trees exists.
Okay.
So the work in most forest management is to then come through and thin out the trees that are no longer doing well because they're now experiencing too much shade, and there are meant to be things that do better in shade, thinning it out so that they're not so close together, dropping some of the wood so that you have old wood that's dead on the ground that represents old disturbances. And then the thinning out creates nuances of light, of different exposures. You have different levels of shade and sun throughout. And then that from there, you have the opportunity to begin to rebuild. So right now I'm in the work of thinning, um, having less trees in order to have better, healthier, older trees that are further spread apart and also have more dead wood on the ground, which in California is challenging because you don't want to create fire damages. And also in the way that we've suppressed natural disturbances like fire, we've created for ourselves in California a condition where now everything is so laden with unburned dry fuel for many generations of fire suppression that the only real hope is to mechanically thin out all the dry wood, which would be to chop it all up or to burn it out. And so, unfortunately, beyond our control, many places are experiencing fire at a degree that was much worse than it ever was when disturbances were happening a lot more regularly. Because
Oh,
now there's so much more fuel than there ever was before.
oh, yeah, gosh. Um, it's so fascinating. I just love listening to you talk about it because I can hear how much you connect with it. And so this park that you're working on has a name.
Tierra Linda. It's named for my mother.
Okay. I love that. And so would you I okay, so the videos that you're showing that you are making are showing the value of natives
Yeah,
mainly, but
yeah.
there are so many things that we can do that don't require huge effort on our part. Um, but I love that you make it easy, that it's not like, spending tons of money or, this huge undertaking. It's literally just planting plants. Like we all
Yeah, it's
do that in the
simple and
city.
it's also scalable to every single level for anyone's access. So if you don't have any space to any earth to garden in, then you can have a potted plant that is native, and if it's flowering, it's attracting insects, it's feeding insects. So just picking native flowers and keeping them potted, that's an easy win for everyone. And there's few limitations to that. But if you are lucky enough to have a space where you can put something into the earth, then putting natives into the ground in ways that reflect natural systems is vital. And I want to empower people to recognize that it's not a zero-sum game, that you don't have to do like a totally wild native garden, and that we're not limited by natives. We're actually empowered by natives, and we're given an opportunity to create even more a menagerie within our gardens that's more complex than if we just stuck to exotics or ornamentals that our grandparents loved. But if you have something that you're emotionally attached to, that your grandmother, your grandmother had hydrangeas and you want hydrangeas, we have permission to do both.
Right.
And that at every level, any introduction of pieces of the native puzzle, they are offering complexity back into the native system. And that like I love to imagine a world where we have suburbs that are reflective of the environment that they displaced, which is so profound because we could actually do nothing we don't even need to restore giant wild spaces to get back enough so we could sequester enough carbon in suburban gardens to offset all of climate change and do nothing else. Like we could save ourselves just by converting our suburban gardens to mostly native gardens and managing them in ways that was a little bit more sustainable. So I speak to using natives, but then also how to garden and how to manage and design with natives in a way that is more mirroring more natural, less involved ways, um, and also educating on rewilding.
Yeah. That's really profound, though, what you said, Christopher, about the native plant. If we planted natives in suburban gardens, it could sequester enough carbon to offset. Like,
Yeah, or we could also take 10% of our least productive agricultural land. Um, and also there, if we've replanted natives wherever that agricultural land is, and take the space that wasn't even that productive, take 10% of the least productive land. If we rewilded that, we would also sequester enough carbon to have offset all of climate change. And we could make no changes at all to the rest of the fabric of our society. And also we would appreciate a net gain in our productivity of those productive lands because we'd be creating health across the whole system and then if we created an interconnected web of those 10% strips, if every farm had a 10% allocation of land that was native, then native populations, because like I was saying earlier, like native to one spot is different than native to just a mile away or even 100 miles away. So, but dispersal of native animals and insects is a component piece that we don't really have right now because our lands are so divided by fences and freeways. And the opportunity for one thing to get from one spot to another or for it to migrate in ways that reflect how things were before everything was so chopped up into private ownership. Um, we need to have an opportunity across the whole land for that to happen, a web, if you will, or corridors. They're often referred to as corridors. So we could create corridors through farmland and also sequester carbon that way. So there are ways that we don't have to completely transform what we our comfortable world and still get a land that is safe for us indefinitely.
right? I mean, there's plenty of land. There's so much land. We just
Yeah.
plant some natives and let them go because they're gonna take over on their own. Um, wow, gosh, just to think about that. Are you guys listening to this? Because this is really good. And so you brought up the rewilding subject. So let's go. Let's go.
So what got me into this whole excited work into natives is understanding what rewilding is. And in the United States, rewilding, the example that's always touched on is Yellowstone, which we already talked about. There's some other global projects. There's a farm in Britain called Neps Farm. I may be saying that wrong. And Oostvaardersplassen, which is in the Netherlands, and there are other large scale projects. Scotland or maybe Ireland. I'm embarrassed to admit ignorance and that I can't tell them apart. Please forgive me, but I think it's the Scottish Highlands are rewilding. So the heathers that we see now are not a true reflection. They've been overgrazed. So there's the entire Scottish Highlands are going to be rewilded, and there's projects in Asia and in Siberia that I couldn't name, but I know are happening. So like looking into those projects and like I had mentioned earlier, Oostvaardersplassen, Neps Farm, and Yellowstone all happened in the 90s. So, and now we have more than 20 years experience, but you could see that at each of those projects that at any moment which a new species entered into the ecosystem, then the following year its representation would grow exponentially. And birds in Britain, this project, Neps Farm, um, has become the most important breeding grounds of migratory birds coming out of Africa in all of Britain, and birds that were thought to only be able to roost in the most extreme mountaintops. And ecologists expected that's the only place they wanted to go. It was really because they didn't have any space for them in Britain. And so now that there's this farm that oh, here's the other cool thing that you can go there on safari now and see wild animals in herds in ways that like you're in African safari. You can go to Britain on safari and see wild animals in wild context in herds. Isn't that so cool? And in Oostvaardersplassen as well, you can see native animals in native herds. It's so cool. And also a high concentration of all of the biodiversity of birds that are migratory in and out of those spaces are dependent on those lands.
It's
So it's really exciting.
fascinating.
And so you can go, it provides sustainability for the land in that it's now financially solvent, but it's a educational model for everyone to come see how simple and easy it is and how cool and complex we can make our land again. And that's really exciting. So, like, what is rewilding? Rewilding isn't, as the name implies, really letting things go wild. When we step back and look at the way that humans lived on lands outside of Europe, generally we lived within the system rather than imposing our system into the land. So the European model of farming was always about creating a farm that was sort of external to the natural world and fenced off from and cleared of all of the natural system, where you're sort of starting from the dirt, which is crazy if you really think about it. Like we don't live in dirt, we live in these beautifully complex worlds. And so all of the indigenous people all throughout the world were living in lands that they did manage as farmland but not as farms. So they were inputting their work, the work that they put into it was in the best interest of serving abundance and offering the most benefit to the most amount of things because they understood that if there was a lot of living things there, they could then take from those living things sustainably. And so their goals there were to reinforce the systems that already existed. And so when European colonists got to those places, any continent, and say any continent, they didn't see that there were that the land of abundance that they experienced, they thought was because it was wild, but it was really because it was managed in a way that was working within the wild system. So rewilding isn't just letting things go wild and doing nothing. It's about looking at the way that the system works and then using our effort to manage the land in a way that is systemic and reflects wild systems. So, we mow land and we rake our leaves and we do all these really bizarre land management practices that don't actually reflect the way that natural systems work. And so, another component of what I speak to is how do we manage land in ways that reflect the system that was there. It's actually a lot less work and a lot less gasoline. And so it's fundamentally more sustainable and less work to work within the system than against it.
Okay. And so in our responsibility in that is to just encourage the native plants and the, wildlife and everything to do their thing and just like kind of just encourage it and I mean, are we like watering and we're not pruning really? Or I guess we would prune trees, right?
Well, thank you. Those are great questions because it's personal. And so you can meet what rewilding means at every single level. So if you want a really ordered garden that looks like we imagined gardens to look, you can have that. And you can have a very tightly clipped garden using some or all natives and still manage it in a more traditional way. I like to encourage the idea of working in thirds or like that it doesn't have to be universally applied. So I like to particularly in suburban settings where you have old boomers and young people, all these different generations of people with their expectations of what good land stewardship looks like. Like to the oldest among us, it's just nothing but oversheared shrubs and oversheared lawn and a monoculture of lawn, and that to them speaks to your responsible citizen
Right.
like
Look at my perfect lawn.
and you can have some of that, right? So I think in order to get buy-in and you get universal appeal to everyone, if you have a small lawn and you have it up front where it matters and you groom that lawn and you keep that lawn perfectly green and perfectly tailored, then no one can look at your garden and say, "Oh, this person doesn't mow their lawn." You have that available. So if the front third is meets everyone's expectations of uniformity and monoculture and fine, give that to them. One small space devoted to that older expectation of land management. And then you have like this middle third where you are a little bit looser in your interpretation of what it means to groom it. So a little more leaf litter, if you have coarse branches that blow down in the storm, get rid of those, but leave some of the finer leaf litter. Don't clip it it doesn't need to be clipped so. And in context of like a lawn, what if that section of the lawn you interpreted as a meadow instead of a lawn? So you have a concept that's adjacent to a lawn. It's adjacent to to the front section of lawn, so that you have this beautiful continuity between the two spaces, and you're signaling to any viewer, hey, lawns can also be meadows. All in one vista, they can exist at once. So that middle ground can be middly interpreted with wildness. It can be middly managed with a medium amount of work. And you're not so focused on putting all your energy on everything being perfect everywhere, but focus on that perfection up where people see it the most, and it's in the foreground of what people see. And then in the back, that's an opportunity. So, everyone rakes their leaves in the fall, but that's not mirroring what happens in natural systems. In natural systems, the leaf litter accumulates with every season and creates this beautiful deep layer of humus, really rich soil that if you blow off those leaves, what you end up with is a compacted, dry, dead soil. So it's not healthy ultimately. We're told by the HOA that we have to do it,
Right.
but if you do it on the walks and on the lawns and you put it to the back of the bed where people can't see it, or they're not going to be offended because it's clear that it's a loved garden, then you're going to get away with it. So that rear third is a space for the biggest scale of things, be it bigger plants. And that's also like we're using classical design when we speak in terms of thirds, because then you have this front third of low, a middle third of middle ground and middle space is middle scale, and then you have the biggest scale in the rear. So we're using classical design, uh, and people will look at that well-designed space, um, and not they won't. It speaks to everyone. And the person who wants it to be wild and native will see what they want to see from that. And the person who expects you to have a lawn is going to see the lawn. So, it doesn't have to be universally applied to your question. And we can all participate at all levels. And for the person who really cannot get their head around the idea of leaf litter being in a garden, then just clear your leaf litter. Just like it's your garden, do what you want. Like you're no one's going to want to buy in if they feel like they're being told what to do, but everyone wants to buy in if they feel like they get to express themselves at the level. But if you tell people like, hey, you have permission to not groom your leaves, and if you want to groom most of them and then hide them at the back of the bed under your shrubs where no one's going to see them, who's going to not want to do that? It's like it's an easy win for everyone, and it's ultimately less work. And if you're paying for a mow and blow landscape service to come and mow your lawn and stuff, it's less to pay for, it's less work for them to do, it's less gas for the blowers, it's less gas for the mowers. So, it's easy to answer your question is that you decide for yourself and you can decide to what extreme you want to manage it and how little you want it to be wild or how much you want it to be wild. But as soon as you give people that permission, I've found that increasingly they want it to be more wild.
Right.
And
Especially,
as older people go away with their expectations of what it means to have this overly imposed landscape, we're given more and more permission. And then I think there's another component piece, which is the education part of it. So gardening is such a fun community experience when you're in your own garden and you're especially like in a suburban setting and you see people out with their kids or riding bikes or pushing strollers, like they say hello, they tell you a beautiful garden. It's an opportunity to discuss, to have conversations with the people that you live with in your own community. And so it's an opportunity for you to engage with them while you're doing what you're doing. And then another really fun, easy, passive way to encourage people to think in terms of that is put a little sign up that says, excuse my dust, excuse my weeds, these are native plants for butterflies. And as soon as you frame it for people, they see the intention and they will dismiss what they otherwise would have thought as being weedy as intentionally native for that one small section or all of it. And then that right away triggers thought in them, oh, okay, this is an intentionally loosely interpreted space. And no one doesn't want butterflies. You're a sociopath if you don't want butterflies. So that's an easy way to get people in on like saying, oh, I put in milkweed because I want to support monarchs. And people are going to be like, oh wow, where did you get them? Can I have some seeds? It's an opportunity for discussion. And people who are even the most rigid in their interpretation of what a suburban garden or any kind of land stewardship looks like, the most rigid among us will yield when you say it's for butterflies. So just a little sign off to the side will signal to any viewer that that the work is intentional and that they need to be slightly forgiving
Or just back off.
or celebrate it, you
Right.
know.
Yeah, totally. I
And
mean,
in places with really firm HOAs, like there are definitely people who are fighting this fight, and you to be outspoken and to go to the HOA meetings and say, "Hey, this is ludicrous. Like what you want, what your expectations of me are not sustainable and are ultimately actually bad for our homes here and our land here. So yes, I'll mow my lawn, but you need to let me introduce native plants." And more, those battles are being won and they're scalable, right? So you can start with at least letting them allow you to do natives and then move on from there.
yeah. I had seen something somebody was saying one of the things that you can do to fight fight back to HOAs is just to gather as, like make friends in your neighborhood and say, how do you feel about this? I feel like it's a little harsh or whatever. And then, you get enough people together and be like, we don't like your role,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, and back to it not being zero sum. Like if you just did 40% natives and mixed them in with the things that your neighbors are planting, no one's going to notice.
Mhm.
So it can be peppered in at any level. Only one kind of plant that you love, or many, many, many plants. And the more people get excited, and the sad thing is we don't know what's native to us. Like I had to find out. Even though I grew up where I live now, the things that I associated with my childhood, none of those things were native. So
Right.
finding out, exploring what is native, and then now I can recognize what are natives to the communities around me, but the people around me don't necessarily know. So when you educate them on, and some of those things are available at nurseries. Oh, this is another important conversation is that like, resources are challenging and so the only way that we're going to have resources and access to more plants, more native plants is to demand that the spaces that are offering plants to us sell us native plants.
Yeah.
Right. If we're gonna if we're gonna work within the capitalist system, then we vote with our dollars. It's important to go into a nursery and say, "Hey, where's your native plant section?" And if they say to you, "We don't have one," you still signal to them that they need to be selling natives, that there's a demand for natives. And you'll find that in time, even the most, pansies and impatiens nursery that only sold colorful bedding will introduce a section. So you have to demand it. You have to not it doesn't have to be demanding, but you have to ask for it. And even if they have to say no, they are forced to say no.
Right.
And then once you have a yes, then start reinforcing and buying those things. So you can buy them commercially, but the more that we buy them commercially, the better the commercial market will be for them.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to ask one of the questions that I've had is how do you find out? And I know you were saying we don't always know what is native, but what's the best way to find out what's native in your area? Do you know?
Well, you can research it just with a quick Google search, and that's fairly easy. If you want to sort of approach it from more of a community level, then look into your native plant society. There's wherever you are, there is a plant society for every imaginable kind of plant, including native plants. So there'll be an orchid society and a begonia society where you live, but there'll also be a native plant society. So you can join those groups, and it'll be a bunch of like retired old fuddy-duddies and a bunch of like neurodivergent plant geeks who are really excited to talk about whatever that kind of plant is, and they'll want to trade with you. And so it's a great resource because you'll have access to rare, hard to get plants, but you'll also just be in a community that's really supportive of those discussions, and they'll have other resources on how to get more.
Yeah, I was going to say, and also the stories.
Yeah, I love engaging with old people who are freaks about a certain topic, and
Yeah,
they have
yeah.
the free time to support you, and so that's I love engaging with people of different generations, so that's really fun for me,
Mhm.
and then also like visiting native forward parks or gardens. They'll oftentimes have small like gift shops that sell some plants, and then also, granted that you're not allowed to do this in sort of national parks, but in settings of like natural settings, once you come to recognize the natives, then harvesting seeds is the most fundamental sort of way of propagating natives. And so you often see roadside stands of native plants that once you recognize them, you can wait till they go to flower, go to seed, and then go harvest a small amount. So either with permission or very judiciously. You don't want to be greedy or aggressive and not allow for them to propagate in their own space. So ask for permission where you can. Don't take them from spaces where it's forbidden, and take as little as you can so that you're not leaving an impact of having cleared anything.
Ooh, I love that. That's a really good point. This is so interesting, and it's so important. And clearly, from your experience, it's not that hard, and it's not that big of a deal, but at the same time, it's a really big deal. Um,
And what's cool is that it reinforces your connection to your own place. And where we live is all personal to where we are. And like I grew up here in California in this community, and like now I can celebrate the lands around me and see the natives in the space like on a drive on the freeway. I can recognize the connection. And how cool is it to live in a world like, let's go back to the suburban idea. Like how cool is it to live in a suburban home that is reflexive of the giant natural spaces around you, so that when you look out into the land, you see your own front garden in context of wherever you are. And then it gives you pride of place. So we can then celebrate the native daisy of wherever we came from, or the native aster. And there's asters across the whole country. So, like, how cool is it to get to know your aster and celebrate your aster in the same way that we celebrate like home teams or whatever,
Whatever that game is, I don't
sports
know.
ball.
Right. Works well. Exactly. And the connection to the earth, like just feeling that, the grounding from being
And then
part of.
another thing that I wanted to explore with you, and that is a whole other thing that people can explore or not explore, is first of all, there's the idea of keystone species, which is like there are some species, not all, they don't provide the same amount of ecological service universally. So some things provide more eco service than others. For instance, in California, ceanothus or California lilac, that is a host plant for like 17 different caterpillars. So that's a heavy hitter. Um, all across the country, oaks generally tend to be keystone species. They create the conditions for other species to thrive. They create the nutrients or the capacity, the food source, the shade, the whatever, the old wood. So almost anywhere you are, oak is a keystone species. So you can explore what are the things that provide the most, either habitat, ecospace, or food or fruit or whatever for the other species. So how supportive are the plants you're choosing? And so, if you're going to limit yourself to only a few natives, then certainly seek out keystones for your area. And then another element that is a huge discussion, it's not my discussion to have necessarily, but it is interwoven into this discussion, is native food sources. So, we have South American food sources. They've entered the vernacular of all cuisines across the globe. There's a huge list. The North American food sources, there's very few that entered the palate universally. We have corn, we have squash. There may be others, but there's not very many more. But North America was full. Everywhere you were was a garden of edible plants, and so that foragers can speak to this, and there's definitely a movement of foragers, and then also a movement around us of celebrating indigenous cuisine and resurrecting indigenous cuisine culture, which we should all support. But what's exciting is that we can look for native plants that are unwittingly also food sources for us. So your garden doesn't have to be like a vegetable garden over here, but we can have beautiful ornamental plants that are also edible all around us, which is another cool thing that we can explore. So that's another like pretty much most of the country will have some form of camas, or quamash would be the native word. It's a flowering bulb, kind of in the onion family, very showy, so beautiful garden plant. And it was one of the most principal starch sources for all of North America, especially the prairies. But there were these starchy bulbs all across the country, and regionally specific, and some of them really widely, like camas specifically was all across the whole country, and a very important food source for native people. And they were Europeans ate them too, to the extent that they ate them all. And they're not really present, but there's a native Quamish or camas wherever you are. And then the leaves of all kinds of plants around you are either medicinal or edible in ways that I'm only just unpacking. So that's an exciting territory for us all to sort of explore. What are the native plants? They're designed to grow where you are, to thrive where you are with very little input by virtue of their own evolution there. So it's exciting to explore what are the things from our native landscapes that we can plant that'll offer food to us, or the things that we depend on for food.
Okay, so like variety and the food part is clearly important and that's so interesting that that North America doesn't have many native foods. I didn't really consider that. Um, so very, very interesting.
And I
So
guess back to like the idea of like engaging with other groups, we can also participate in, for the first time ever, really celebrating Indigenous voices and recognizing that they have ancestral understanding of the spaces that we exist in now, that they have the keys to that understanding. And so engaging with Native communities, asking them what was Native here. I've done that. I've done similar work in my own projects of, to the best of my ability, engaging with Native communities and saying, "Hey, what was here to your understanding that we're missing now that could
uh,
be part of the system?" And that's a fun opportunity for us all to participate. And I feel like it gives all Native people back agency. I don't. There is a land back movement where we're giving back land, but just in the act of engaging with Native people and inviting them into the conversation about the land that is our suburban home that we don't intend to give them, but we want them to feel like they are participating in those conversations. It gives them back the power that they actually have. They have the capacity to help us understand the land that we're living in. And I think that they're ready, as willing as we are ready to invite that conversation.
I love that. And again, stories. And getting to know other people. And I the you said the phrase keystone species, which I've never really heard of, but that sounds it sounds like a really important piece. Like
It
you've
is, and they'll be different everywhere you are. The idea of a keystone is in the same way that the keystone supports the arch, and so all the other stones are dependent on that one stone. Keystones are sort of the idea that you have in the way that the wolf was a keystone. So without unwittingly, the goal was to like make the park safer for people and for the elk and the deer, but without realizing that like that the rivers, the course of the rivers was dependent on the wolves. Like that's crazy. Or
yeah,
that the aspen that we would have no aspen if you shot a wolf. Like that interconnectedness is kind of crazy. And so not everything is as interconnected as others. Some things have offer a contribution that's bigger than others. It's not weighted equally. So looking for the things that provide the most amount of something or provide the most amount of capacity for other things is those are the heavy hitters. That's the low hanging fruit. So
right.
it's easiest to do those things.
And I'm gonna have to look up what a California lilac looks like because I
Yeah,
wonder.
it's like a purpley blue plant that blooms in early spring that's like pretty quintessential to the California landscape.
Yeah,
And gratefully here, there is a lot of it is available um, in commercial growth. There's lots of cultivars, there's lots of showy ones that have been developed for gardens.
sure.
And wherever you are, like if you're in the prairies, there's echinaceas and goldenrods and things that were native to the prairies that you can look for. It doesn't matter where you are, there are going to be natives that have entered into popular horticultural cultivation that are available. And then there's also going to be a ton, sadly, of things that are not available because they just were never thought of as showy or whatever, or they weren't easy to grow. And so
Right.
those are the things that you can challenge yourself with scavenging hunting. I've challenged myself. Like I try to familiarize myself with the list of natives on any project. I look up the natives for any project I'm working on, and then I challenge myself with tracking down as many as I can, and then also getting the client as excited as they're going to get to the degree that they'll allow for me to plant them or themselves get so excited that that's what they want. And I've had some people just completely transform from not that wasn't the focus of what they engaged me for to begin with to being like calling me up when they see a new butterfly for the first time or saw a new pollinator bee that they never saw before.
Oh, that's so fun. Starting out like just I want a pretty garden, and then you add those in, and they're like, "Ooh, I love this, but I love this."
Yeah, so it could be showy and it could be beautiful and it could be classic or it could be wild and free. It could be all the things each of us gets to decide that and that's cool. And in one way, like back to like the idea of HOAs where like uniformity and like the sort of overall appearance of the neighborhood is important. If you have natives as the backdrop, then you have continuity across all the gardens, but then you can also personalize it by things that you love. So I just think that it's an exciting opportunity to offer pride of place for any place.
Pride of place. That's great. I love that. Christopher, when I say the word sustainability, what does that mean to you?
I thought a lot about it. Um, and there's that adage about we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our grandchildren. And the word it's I used to give guided tours at the Conservatory of Flowers here in San Francisco, and one of the things I loved to touch on was this shift in what conservation means or meant. And I think sustainability is the same in that like conservation 100 years ago was not about conserving for the good of all. It was actually kind of weirdly selfish, and it was like the idea to conserve for oneself. So, like water conservation 100 years ago was the building of dams, or like conserving water for your own use. Whereas now we think of water conservation as conserving so that more people can have more. Um, and so a conservationist to the Victorians was like going into the jungle, stealing orchids, and then bringing them back and growing them in a glass house that we called a conservatory
Got
that
it.
only wealthy people could afford. Like that's like the opposite of what we think of as conservation now, but that's what conservation meant
Right.
then. And then even like conservationists 100 years ago, when we have the park system first growing, like their interpretation of what to conserve means still had to do with personal use. It was like personal enjoyment or whatever. So that's why we have parks for camping and for hiking. Like, so we interpret conservation now as totally different. Like we're trying to, but what does conservation mean in national parks? It's still about sort of keeping it static. And so
Yeah.
I thought about, well, what does sustain mean? Like at its most fundamental, it's like to keep something going in its same capacity forever. But is that what we really want to do? I think that what we really want to do is we want to create a legacy that's richer than what we came upon.
Oh.
So I think sustainability is not as much about protecting what we have, but imagining also what it could be, like seeing what's missing and trying to make a more complex offering than we were given. So I also think that there's a component now which we're sort of now we have to add into our understanding of sustainability of how can we make it richer? Not just how can we keep what we have, but how can we make it even more abundant? And knowing that abundance begets abundance, biodiversity gets biodiversity, and that with an abundant world surrounding us, we have a much easier time experiencing abundance for ourselves.
Hmm. Gosh, that's so good. That's really good. And I know before we hit record, we were talking about just to not miss on this beautiful thought that you had had about light.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Well, if you think we're in incredibly dark times, a lot of people around me are indifferent, and a lot of people are keeping their head in the sand, and a lot of people are experiencing a lot of grief and fear. And I think that at all levels, at all perspectives, we're all reacting from some level of fear. So I think that that's universal, and it doesn't matter where you land on the spectrum. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of fear and darkness. And so I was thinking about the ways in which we right now have an opportunity to recognize that yes, we are in very dark times, that darkness surrounds us, and the news cycle is overwhelming and unrelenting and bizarre, and it's easy to get swept up in all of the darkness. But that to center ourselves in this moment, we have this opportunity to. I was sort of thinking about in a room full of light, the light is easy. The light's everywhere. You don't see the source of the light. You don't really take in that there are given sources. You just take it for granted that you're in a well-lit room. But when you're in a dark room, if you just open your eyes initially, it may seem completely black, but the longer you attune yourself to where is there any light in the room, you will soon find that there's very rarely spaces that are completely dark. Nothing is ever totally black, and you'll with a little bit of an adjustment period with attuning your eyes toward looking for the light, you'll see that there's light flooding in from under the door, and that there's an alarm clock, and that like suddenly there's enough light for you to see. And also it's very obvious where the light sources are, that the light sources become apparent. They reveal themselves where is the source when you're in a space of darkness. And even when you're overwhelmed by the darkness and there's very little light to see, there is always a source of light. And you can align yourself with the light very simply in dark times because there's no taking anything for granted. the light is obvious and the darkness is obvious, and we'll know light by whether or not we resonate with it. If it makes us feel empowered, full of joy, full of opportunity, or if in our soul, if in our spirit, if in our heart we resonate with a joy or a spark or a sense of warmth or reassurance, that's light. And that will be different for everyone, but everyone will be able to see easily in dark times what is light and also what is dark. And so you just say to yourself, like, the only way through this darkness is to stay grounded and that there are sources of light coming in from everywhere. Maybe not enough of it to fully see the whole breadth and width of the room, but enough for me to understand the basic layout and for me to move toward the light. And so I just was like really grounded in that sense that like it's only black or white. It's only light and dark right now. And there is definitely more dark than light, but now more than ever, it's really obvious to see where the glimmers of light are coming from and how can we move toward those glimmers.
Awesome. I love that. And then, so tricky question,
Mhm.
in these dark times of lots of change, how can people learn more from you? How can people find you to learn more?
Well, I'm on TikTok for the time being. Um, I may or may not have an Instagram account. I do have one. It's deactivated for the time being, and I'll see what happens. But you can definitely follow me on YouTube or at my website. I have a blog on my website, reynoldssebastiani.com, or YouTube.
Okay, super. And I will put that in the show notes. Uh, Christopher Reynolds, thank you so much for sharing your light and your experience with us. And I hope folks will take this to heart and consider growing lots of natives and just, letting it grow and adding biodiversity and more light and more life to the world.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.